Right now, you believe things. You believe the chair you're sitting on will hold your weight. You believe the food you ate this morning wasn't poisoned. You believe the news you checked, the doctor you last visited, the number on your bank statement. You believe hundreds of things every single day without checking them, without being able to check them. You extend trust to systems, to institutions, to experts, and that trust mostly works well enough that you stop noticing you're doing it. But here's the question nobody asks. How did humans decide what was true before any of those systems existed? Before scientists, before universities, before newspapers, peer review, clinical trials, or any institution whose entire purpose was to distinguish reliable knowledge from unreliable knowledge. For the overwhelming majority of human history, those things didn't exist, and yet humans still had to make decisions, constantly, about what to eat and what avoided, about which direction to travel and which to fear, about why someone got sick and whether they would recover, about whether the season would be good or whether something terrible was coming. They decided. They acted. They were often right, not because they were lucky, because they had tools, just not the ones we think of as tools. The first tool was pattern recognition, and it was extraordinarily powerful. Long before anyone had a concept of science, humans were doing something that science would eventually formalize. They were observing, remembering, and connecting. They watched the same plants flower before the rains came for decades, and they filed that away. They noticed that people who drank from certain water sources got sick more often than people who didn't, and they moved away from those sources thousands of years before anyone understood what a bacterium was. The sand people of southern Africa can track an animal across dozens of kilometers of terrain by reading disturbances in the ground so subtle that trained Western trackers consistently fail to see them. This is not instinct. It is a system of knowledge, refined over generations, transmitted through apprenticeship, tested daily against reality. When it's wrong, people go hungry. When it's right, they eat. The feedback loop is immediate and unforgiving, and it produces accuracy that is, in its domain, genuinely extraordinary. This is what anthropologists now call traditional ecological knowledge, and the more carefully researchers study it, the more they find it consistently aligns with what Western science later confirmed through completely different methods. Indigenous communities in the Pacific Northwest knew which salmon runs to protect centuries before fish biologists arrived to measure population collapse. Aboriginal Australians encoded accurate information about sea level changes from over 10,000 years ago in oral narratives that modern geologists have since verified. The knowledge was real. The method was just different. Pattern recognition, transmitted through story and practice, tested against the world, is not a primitive version of science. It is a different implementation of the same underlying logic. Observe, remember, connect, test. The second tool was authority, and it solved a problem that pattern recognition alone couldn't. The problem is this. You can only personally observe a tiny fraction of the world. For everything else, everything you can't see with your own eyes, everything outside your direct experience, you need to borrow someone else's knowledge. And that means you need a way to decide whose knowledge to borrow. Every human society ever studied has solved this the same way, by identifying certain people as epistemically trustworthy, as people whose claims about the world carry more weight than a stranger's, elders who had accumulated decades of observation, specialists whose entire life was dedicated to a narrow domain, the healer, the navigator, the metalworker, the midwife. Religious figures who were believed to have access to sources of knowledge unavailable to ordinary people. This is not so different from what we do now. You have never personally verified the germ theory of disease. You have never replicated a clinical trial. You believe these things because trusted institutions, built by people you've never met, tell you they are true, and those institutions have track records that justify the trust. The structure is identical. Only the institutions have changed. What made ancient authority systems work was the same thing that makes modern ones work: reputation, track record, and social consequence for being wrong. The healer whose patients kept dying lost patients. The navigator who ran ships aground stopped being trusted with ships. The feedback mechanisms were slower and less formal than peer review, but they weren't absent. They were just embedded in social life rather than in institutions. The third tool was the most misunderstood, and in some ways the most sophisticated. Myth. We use the word now to mean something that isn't true. A misconception, a false belief. But for most of human history, myth wasn't the opposite of truth. It was the primary technology for encoding and transmitting truth, particularly the kind of truth that is difficult to state directly. Consider what a myth actually does. It takes a complex, abstract, often dangerous piece of knowledge about human nature, about consequences, about how communities fail, and it wraps it in a concrete narrative with memorable characters and vivid outcomes. It makes the knowledge emotional as well as intellectual, because emotional memory is more durable than abstract recall. And it makes the knowledge communal, a shared reference point that everyone in a culture can invoke without needing to re-explain the underlying principle. Icarus flew too close to the sun. You don't need to explain the psychological concept of hubris to someone who grew up with that story. The story carries it for you. The myth of Pandora's box encodes something deeply accurate about the psychology of curiosity, the unintended consequences of opening sealed systems, and the almost impossible task of putting something back once it's been released. Whether or not there was ever a literal box is entirely beside the point. What researchers studying oral cultures have found, consistently, is that mythological traditions tend to encode practical knowledge alongside symbolic meaning. Greek myths about particular winds and sea monsters correspond to actual navigational hazards in the Mediterranean. Stories about which foods cause illness, which behaviors bring social catastrophe, which seasons demand caution. These circulate as myth and carry genuine information even when the explanatory framework surrounding them is entirely wrong. The information survives even when the explanation doesn't. The fourth tool was ritual, and it did something none of the others could do alone. It handled uncertainty. Because here's the problem no epistemology fully solves, ancient or modern. Sometimes you genuinely don't know. You've observed as carefully as you can. You've consulted everyone whose knowledge you trust. You've invoked every relevant narrative. And reality still hasn't given you a clear answer. The harvest might fail. The patient might die. The battle might go either way. Ritual didn't pretend to solve uncertainty. What it did was provide a structure for acting confidently despite it. A way of saying, we have done everything within our power. We have honored the process. Whatever comes, we faced it with the right preparation and the right intention. This is not irrational. This is, in fact, what good decision-making frameworks do. The pre-surgery checklist in a modern hospital doesn't guarantee the surgery will succeed. It reduces preventable error and gives the team a shared structure for proceeding under pressure. The function is identical to the ritual preparations of an ancient community before a dangerous hunt. The metaphysics are different. The psychology is the same. There is also growing evidence that ritual has direct physiological effects that help explain its persistence. Repeated ceremonial actions reduce cortisol, synchronize group behavior, and produce the neurological conditions associated with trust and cooperation. The ritual wasn't just symbolically useful. It was literally changing the state of the people performing it in ways that made them more effective at whatever they were about to do. Now here's what's strange. We replaced all of these tools gradually with a single one, the scientific method. And by any reasonable measure, that replacement was the most successful epistemic upgrade in human history. The discoveries it produced changed everything. We live longer, know more, and understand reality at scales, from quantum mechanics to cosmology, that would be unimaginable to any previous human. But the replacement was never complete. And in the places where it didn't reach, the old tools didn't disappear. They adapted. Pattern recognition became folk wisdom. Then internet health forums. Then the kind of confident claim your uncle makes at dinner based on something he noticed and generalized too far. The underlying cognitive machinery is identical to what produced traditional ecological knowledge. The difference is the quality of the feedback loop. Without consistent, honest consequences for being wrong, pattern recognition drifts into confirmation bias. Authority became credentialism, then expert culture, then the strange modern situation where trust in institutions has collapsed faster than institutions can explain why they deserve it, leaving people applying the ancient authority-borrowing heuristic, who do I trust? In an information environment that is specifically designed to exploit it. Myth became ideology, then narrative politics, then the modern media ecosystem where the stories that spread fastest are the ones that are most emotionally resonant, which is exactly what myth was designed to do, just without the long communal process that used to filter which story survived. Ritual became habit, then self-help routine, then the productivity system in the app on your phone, which is trying, without using that word, to give you a structure for acting confidently under uncertainty. We didn't abandon these tools. We kept using them, without the frameworks that made them work. The scientific method is the most reliable, truth-finding system humans have ever built. That is not in question, but it answers a specific kind of question, the kind that can be operationalized into a testable hypothesis, measured, replicated, and falsified. It is genuinely poorly suited to the questions humans actually live by. How should I treat the people I love? What do I owe my community? What kind of life is worth living? What do I do when everything I thought was stable turns out not to be? Ancient epistemologies were built primarily for those questions. Not because ancient people were wiser, but because those were the questions that determined whether you lived or died, whether your community held together or fell apart, whether the people around you could trust you when it mattered. We inherited their questions. We mostly forgot their answers. And we build an extraordinary machine for knowing things that sometimes leaves us less certain of what to do with what we know than our ancestors were, navigating by stars and story and the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of paying careful attention. You believe things right now that you've never verified. Some of them are true. Some of them are wrong. Some of them you'll never know either way. That has always been the human condition. The tools have changed. The problem is identical. We just used to know we didn't know, and we built entire civilizations around the wisdom of admitting that.